Well, Enrico, I would like to ask you first if you could describe the work that's being presented, the Chicken Man Gong.
Yeah, sure. The work is a two-part sculpture, so it composes of one large metal object, which is in the shape of a gong, more or less, and a vitrine, which is at the other end of the room, which contains elements which somehow refer to the work. The gong has, in its physicality, represents, well, it's made out of brass, the central part, the actual gong part, and steel, painted steel on the outside. I painted the steel myself. The work was produced by the Tate in London, the Tate Britain, as a commission for a sculpture court project that they run once a year to commission artists to produce a piece of work there. The image of the piece stems out of a painting which I did some months before I was commissioned this work, and is a series of five large canvases which I worked on, fabrics which I bought in India. There are elements which are drawn from either art historical sources, like the legs are from a photograph by Pierre Molinier, which is a French kind of associated surrealist, if you want, later on in his life, where he was making these self-portraits of himself. The tail and the head are completely figures in my imagination, so they don't stem out of anywhere. And I think that originally the work was not meant to be a gong. In its two-dimensional form was not meant to be a gong. But when I was asked to do this project, I then started to think about evolving this piece into a dimension which would involve somehow a dynamic of dialogue between the work, the artist, the curator, the institution. So in a sense, the gong represents almost like a kind of an expression of language or a request. And when I first presented this project, I actually called it a monument to unreasonable requests, because the gong is activated by me contacting the museum personnel at any given time during the opening hours of the museum to bang the gong without any pre-ordered event or any kind of structure to the request. So it kind of is a test of response.
In a museum, a vitrine usually has a sort of didactic function, and I was wondering if this vitrine, part of Chicken Man Gong, functions in the same way here.
It partially does, in that in its kind of individual element, in its individual elements, it represents a form of background to the sculpture element, but also it acts as a form of parody or mimicking. So it's like a form of imitation of the original performance of a vitrine. It's almost like an area of conflict or an area of problem somehow. And I cannot really get into the specific because in a way the elements that I gathered for the vitrine came quite instinctively and in a rather impulsive way. So there wasn't a kind of a strategic build up to the work. So I selected images and I produced objects that I felt were instinctively representing a correlation or a complicity with the original maquette, which is also included in the vitrine. And also, I think in its performance of a didactic role, for me it was interesting to kind of try and investigate the idea of expectations and how audiences or people who use art as viewers or artists or anyone who actually approaches an artwork as a viewer expects to understand the kind of the demands or the offerings of the work. And that often leaves us with a sense of, or at least me personally sometimes, when the explanation is so clear or there's something so kind of academic maybe around the work, it leaves me with a sense of maybe emptiness or certain personal questions that don't find encouragement in being asked to myself. So there is an openness to the work for me, and there is a lack of clarity to the work. But for me, that is almost a kind of an invitation for us to ask ourselves rather than what the work means, what do we mean when we experience work?
We see elements that are found, like found photographs,
Yes.
for instance.
Yes.
The book that you took, but also elements that you made yourself.
Yes.
Like the daggers.
Yes,
And
yes.
perhaps we can see the aspect of conflict
Yeah.
most clearly in the daggers.
Yes, but also there were these, they represent again a kind of the correlative ritualized aspects of the gong itself. So in a way I wanted to almost kind of celebrate the ethnographic kind of aesthetic in a way of the work. So almost recreate an atmosphere of history or of some ritualized performances that might happen, and so the photograph is for instance, from a book on Studio 54, the club in New York in the 70s, which has a very specific kind of quality of almost like a battle or something. There is a kind of an interaction between these objects, which is about also the perfection of certain images and the kind of the aspiration of perfection of certain images, like the James Lee Byers environment, which is in the book, or the daggers again, which represent this kind of accomplished object, but also the failure of this perfection and the way that we actually can only reach a certain point in reconciling the actual insufficiency of our means in a way, either in expressing ourselves or through the works or in understanding what do we expect from the work. Yes, I mean, I'm conscious of the displaced nature of this display, but I believe that there is a generative power in it, or at least is a proposition of a potential generative power.
Or the importance of language.
Yes.
Coming back, like with the small text that you wrote.
Yes.
Also about the impossibility of language to
Yes.
communicate.
Yes, it's the assumption of we connect with the kind of with the way the language is used, and you know, in a way, how do we grow into the use of language in a certain way? And I often use language as a form of raw material, and I use language quite often either as a form of almost like as a plot or as a script from which I then make images, or writing it after I made the work to almost describe or give the work an internal context for itself. So it doesn't actually work as an explanation or a footnote, but it's almost like a sculpture. So language is a form of sculpture also.
Go a little bit deeper about the change of context for the work. You know,
Sure.
First the context was the courtyard.
Yes.
Of Tate Britain in London.
Yes.
Outside, and now the work is presented inside
Yes.
the museum. What does it mean to you? This?
The first impulse that I had about the proposition to do something here was to actually test the visual quality of this piece of work in a context which was actually inside the institution, and to diminish the dilution of the work in its outside context, where it interacts with so much more, so many more features, you know, architectural features and the world. And in a way, I wanted to imagine this work, this room, almost as a kind of an observation post or some kind of a narrower point of scrutiny for the work. And the kind of sound also that would generate, not only physically, but also the resonance of the work within, from within. So it was a kind of an exciting possibility for me to test.